The Cross and Mary. Let us journey in our imaginations to an upper room in Jerusalem, some 2,000 years ago. I, Mary, am part of a fellowship of about 120 followers of Jesus, my Jesus, the beloved Son I bore. Groups of us have been meeting here ever since my Jesus was taken into heaven. Somehow I knew he could not be bound by this world, yet we have not been sad or lonely since he departed in this way. Instead, we have a sense of happiness, even anticipation that God is on the brink of doing something really special. I was brought into this company by John. Dear John, what a son he has become to me since that day. I thought my Jesus had got it so wrong when he cried out to John from the cross to take me home as his mother and to be a son to me. My heart was already breaking because I was losing my dearest and best son before my very eyes. But I have other sons who could have taken care of me. Why was Jesus wrenching me away from them to give me to John? Must I lose them too? But Jesus was so right, as it turned out. Even from his cross, I should have known I could trust him. Here are two of my sons, James and Jude, both within the fellowship here in this upper room meeting place. In a wonderful way, I have gained these other sons in a relationship I never had with them before. That day at the cross, the longest, bitterest day of my life. They say that a drowning man sees scenes from his whole life flashing by as he descends the depths. I felt like that too. As I watched the lifeblood of my Jesus ebbing away, I felt I was suffocating in misery and pain, and I was seeing all the scenes of my life since Jesus became a part of me. It was a bitter experience. I felt all the regrets for glorious times now being dashed to pieces. I could feel all my misgivings now being so cruelly justified by the horror of this terrible end. The feelings, memories, and emotions of all these scenes of my life came back so vividly. I'd always been one to treasure them and ponder them in my heart. I first knew about Jesus when God's angel came and told me I would be with child by the Holy Spirit. Of course, I was so young. I hardly understood what this could mean for my life. It seemed like a dream, and something in me really wished that that was all it was. After all, what was I to say to my family, to Joseph? I began to hope I might have imagined it. But the angel had told me about Elizabeth, my mother's cousin. Maybe if I could see her, she would help me understand. It wasn't hard to let my parents let me go and see her. I think they thought I was out of my mind. Maybe her good sense would talk me out of an active imagination. I can understand them thinking that about me, yet it seemed so cruel at the time. But then my other children and I thought the same thing about Jesus later on. Elizabeth. What a comforting thought that was. On my way to see her, I began to know that everything was going to be all right. It was so strange when I arrived. Everything seemed to happen so quickly. The sight of the dear soul, so elderly, so blooming in her pregnancy. It was strange, touching, almost magical. I'd hardly begun to realize what I was thinking when she almost knelt before me in homage. The mother of my Lord, she called me. Me? To be a mother? Could it really be true then? She said the baby in her womb had jumped for joy at the sound of my voice. And suddenly, before I could respond, I was overwhelmed with a sense of this amazing wonder of God, of everything he was doing for our families, of the things he was doing for the world. He has remembered his promise to our ancestors, to Abraham and to our descendants. He was going to turn the world upside down and pour out so many blessings on ordinary poor families like ours. Everything was going to change. We were to be a part of that change. Before I knew what I was doing, I was singing praise to God and shouting aloud about all these things I'd never understood. I'd hardly known how to believe before. And here was God right inside my own soul, resident in my own humble womb. And he was going to do wonderful things for me. Oh, that stay with Elizabeth gave me so much strength and joy. I could never have faced the future without it. It all came flooding back to me that day at the cross. Then, when my Jesus was born, what a time that was. Joseph had been so worried about me going to Bethlehem with him for the census. We knew how near my time I was. But if my baby was to be a son of David, like the angel had said, then I knew it was right for him to be born in Bethlehem, David's town. Surely this was what God had planned. It was going to be so wonderful. But it seemed such a letdown. It's strange how we think God's will is going to be so neat and tidy. I dreamt of being so organized, so serene and assured. Everything was going to be taken care of, and the whole world would revolve around us. God doing everything to perfection. But that day at the cross taught me that God involves himself in our muddles, just the way they are. He doesn't wait for the world to straighten itself out nicely first. He brings the peace to us from the inside. So when I bore my Jesus, it wasn't in the calm luxury I had dreamt of. It was squalid, cramped, lonely. Just Joseph and me struggling to cope with a birth in a hovel amongst the animals. Had God forgotten us? Had I imagined the build-up? Did I get it all badly wrong? I've learnt to take my comfort from very simple things. Later that night, when I was feeling so strange, so unsure of myself, some hillside shepherds came down into the town and found us. They seemed so awed and thrilled to see my lovely baby. They came with a story that God's angel had sent them. God's angel? Was that a message to assure me that God's angel speaks to other people too? That I hadn't just imagined it? The same things were said about Jesus to the shepherds as had been said to me. Oh, what a reassurance that was. What a relief. I pondered on that for a long time. We came to the temple in Jerusalem shortly after that for the birth ceremonies. It was a strange day. We'd been feeling like any ordinary family going to buy what we needed for the sacrifice. Couldn't afford much. Joseph brought 2 doves as the minimum offering. But all of a sudden there came an old man, Simeon, coming to us, so glad to see us. And then there was Anna, said to be a prophetess. How did they know about my Jesus? But they did know. And the things they said and prophesied made a deep impression on me. They were very wonderful, but very disturbing too. Simeon said, "A sword will pierce your own soul." How true that has been. I felt it so often, but never more so than that day at the cross. A few weeks later, we had an even stranger visit. It seemed the whole world was beating a path to our humble door. Yet isn't this what the scripture said? I never understood it before, but it's amazing how those few weeks have changed for all of us here. We had some foreigners come to look at my baby. We found it hard to understand them, yet they were so gentle, so reverent, and we sensed the privilege of that visit. We Jews are meant to consider ourselves unclean after an encounter with foreigners, but it was all so wonderful that I felt nothing but awe and gratitude. They presented some costly gifts for Jesus. We could hardly imagine what a working family like ours could have for them. But within days, we were on the move. Joseph said our family was in danger and we must protect Jesus. If he was all that God's angel said he would be, wouldn't God automatically protect him? But Jesus has always said that we need to cooperate with God to get his will done. That day we simply had to trust and obey. We traveled to Egypt. We would have been totally without money if those expensive gifts hadn't come to us just in time. God was providing and protecting after all. It was a lot later that I realized what those gifts were all about. Sometimes it takes a voice from outside to tell us what our faith really means. When Jesus was 12, Joseph and I took him to the Passover. He would be an adult in the eyes of the law. My little boy. He was so thrilled with everything. The teachers in the temple loved him. It was hard to tear him away back to our camp at night. The day we left, Jesus had been with some of our friends from Nazareth. We all set off, knowing that they would take care of him. But after a little while, he hadn't been around, and we tried to find him. How odd. Our neighbours simply thought he was back in our group again. Where was he? I began to panic. The sword which Simeon had spoken of, it was gouging a great hole in my heart. We were supposed to protect Jesus. God had entrusted us with the job. Had we failed? He'd never been to Jerusalem before. How would he cope there alone? A 12-year-old adult? He was only my little boy still. Those few hours were among the worst of my life. Until that day at the cross. I couldn't bear to lose him. We ran, we hunted, we asked everybody. Eventually we landed back at the temple. I was crying out to God in desperate prayer. All of a sudden, my prayer was heard, and we saw Jesus. "Why were you looking for me?" he asked. Had my son really grown up and away from me in those few short days? I could hardly bear it. "Did you not know I was bound to be in my Father's house?" I didn't know if it was I or Joseph who was more hurt by the question. But Jesus stayed by our sides after that, and he was a wonderful son to us. I didn't understand what had been going on, and we never discussed it again. When he was 30, Jesus left home to be a preacher. His brothers were well settled near me by then, and I'm sure he knew that they would provide for me. I was sad to think of him moving away, and the village was sorry too. He had been a good workman in Nazareth, and people really respected him. But I knew his life belonged to God in a special way. I was only surprised it had taken so long for this to happen. In the early days, he came back to our synagogue. People seemed so pleased to see him at first. I remember his sermon so vividly. He was claiming to be the fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy. I felt proud and awed. Who was this son I had born? But the atmosphere began to change. It got very nasty, hostile. I was frightened for Jesus. I didn't know how to protect him anymore, but somehow he slipped away and the horrible moment passed. Looking back on it, I could see the scenes of danger. I can't be surprised he landed where it did, on that wretched, deadly cross. We all went to a wedding at Cana. Our whole family had been invited, and some of Jesus' new friends and followers came too. It was so embarrassing for the host. I don't know if it was the unexpected arrival of Jesus' friends or what, but they suddenly began to run short of wine. It was an awful disgrace for them. I thought maybe Jesus ought to do something. After all, if he had brought all those extra guests, then he was somehow responsible for the problem. So I asked Jesus if he could help out. I don't really know quite what I expected him to do. All I know is that I trusted him, even if I didn't sometimes understand him anymore. His reply was odd. He said it wasn't the right time for him yet. He did answer my plea, though. I think of it as a prayer answered now. The wine we drank after that was almost unearthly in its lovely flavour. We often cannot begin to understand God's thoughts, but the things he does for us are quite wonderful. That's how I felt that amazing day. I didn't feel the stab of Simeon's sword. Not then. The piercing pain soon came back again. We hadn't seen Jesus for quite a few months, so my other sons and my daughters and I made arrangements to visit him when he was preaching in Galilee. We sent a message to the house where Jesus was. He was surrounded by a crowd, I remember. Jesus snubbed us. His real family was already around him, he said. Who are my mother, my sisters, and my brothers? Those of you who are my disciples. I felt I'd lost him. It was awful. Just as I felt he was wrenching away all the family I had left that day at the cross. Truly there is a high cost to being a disciple. But I have gained. I have gained. We began to think he was mad. Stories were reaching us about the company he kept, prostitutes, tax collectors, even people with demons. It was dangerous and foolish. People were saying he was turning our sacred law upside down. I could hardly believe that my good boy should have his head turned so. But I was still his mother. My job was still to protect him. We came to take him home. But he wouldn't budge. He made me so sad. But even so, when I saw him, I wasn't so sure he was going mad. My parents had thought that of me all those years ago. I remembered how hurt I had felt. Surely what was driving Jesus wasn't insanity. It was intense, but it wasn't madness. What were we to do? I kept a discreet distance after that. Our family still kept the feasts in Jerusalem. We'd always done that. Jesus used to come with us. There was the time that the other boys started getting onto him. They taunted him about making his ministry more public. He wouldn't travel with us that year. We thought he wasn't coming after all, but he did later. That hurt. Weren't we good enough for him anymore? I could feel Simeon's sword twisting again. It was even worse when we heard him debating with the Pharisees. Their reaction was so different from the way they'd been when he was a lad. Couldn't he see they were out to get him? He seemed to be walking blindly into trouble. But maybe he could see all too well. And it was we that were blind. Jesus knew I loved him, even if I couldn't always understand him. I always tried to be there for him, yet in a strange way it worked the other way. He was always there for me. Those visits to Jerusalem were the beginning of the end. I desperately wanted to get him out of the conflict, but I knew I couldn't deflect him. No, he was not mad or blind. He was never more sane. But his courage baffled me. My heart was bleeding. But I kept it to myself. Yet, I think he knew. I think he could read my thoughts that day at the cross. It didn't make sense. It was such a disaster. But those eyes of his were saying, I know how you feel. Wait and see. It's not in vain. Understanding will come. God is in control. You will have peace. As I watched my beloved son being nailed to the cross, I was realizing a mother's worst nightmare. I could feel and sense all his pain and agony as if it was my own. The son I had brought into the world could never have deserved this torture. He was always so gentle and compassionate with anyone who was suffering. And now all I could see was his twisted, contorted face as he struggled with the searing pain and agony in his hands and his feet, bleeding and bearing his weight, and his gasps for air, while the sagging of his body was pulling on his chest and suffocating the very life breath out of him. All I yearned to do was to be able to take him down and let him go free. I would have taken his place if I could. It was the 3rd hour of the day when they crucified him. He was taunted and mocked by so many enemies. Even the criminals crucified with him didn't let him alone. After 3 hours, the pain intensified, and I knew he was suffering in more than his body. It became dark as night, and Jesus was fighting the very battle of his soul, crying out to God in torment. For 3 more long hours, Jesus struggled with the conflict, and I felt I could see, quite literally, the burden and the weight of the world upon his shoulders. He was carrying so much more than just his own suffering. He was allowing the depths of total human anguish, sin, and failure to enter the very depths of his being. Even up there, he was using every ounce of his strength to drain away the ravages which sin wreaks in other people's lives. It was impossible for me not to feel involved with every breath he took. It was as if I was willing a miracle to happen. The end took me by surprise. Jesus suddenly rallied all his strength and cried to God to receive his spirit. Oh God, why no miracle? I was devastated. My world had fallen apart. All I could do was watch them take his body down and allow John to lead me home. It was a desperate Sabbath that next day. I wanted to die. Jesus was dead and buried. What more was there to live for? John and I were no consolation to each other. Jesus had told him to take me home, but I felt in the way. It was an endless day. But after sunset that evening, there was work to be done. Some of my dear friends, women who have loved and served Jesus too, had begun talking about preparing spices to anoint his body in the tomb. Some of them went out early the next morning, but were back with the most extraordinary news. He isn't there. The empty tomb was such a shock. John left us very abruptly, as did Peter, to run all the way. Nothing would sink in at first. We heard garbled stories, but bit by bit, the news filtered down. He had done it. Jesus had not been held down by death, but was truly alive again. We saw him. We touched him. The disciples received very special visits, and he taught them many things. It was different now. In those few weeks, our emotions were on a seesaw. It was thrilling to know that Jesus was alive, but he wasn't always there for us. It seemed as if the story was not yet complete. He had promised us peace, but that peace was elusive. That peace descended on us after Jesus went back into heaven. There's a delicious sense of anticipation amongst us. And John has been wonderful in helping me to unpack my memories over these weeks. He always thought of himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. He used to be so impetuous, but I have watched him change. He's very patient now, waiting for something, being obedient, as he says, to Jesus' command to stay in the city. Tomorrow will be the day of Pentecost. The city is busy, but we don't feel a sense of danger, just a feeling that God has still more to show us, that Jesus hasn't finished with us yet.